Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party and its genesis. And we'll mostly just focus on chapters 1 and 2. He has a whole lot of letters to Engels at the end that sort of give you a little bit of an idea of their relationship and sort of the history at the time, the zeitgeist of communism and them pushing back against the Industrial Revolution. There are also some retorts to other, what they would say are so-called socialist or communist parties or organizations, and retorts to other, I guess, less Marxian communist philosophies, okay? And so we're mostly they're interesting and you should read them. And it's pretty short. This is a really short piece, so it's not like it was overwhelming. But we're mostly just going to focus on chapters 1 and 2, the main basics, and then I'll offer some criticisms at the end, okay? All right, chapter 1, the bourgeois and proletarians. So, if you're going to talk about Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, you need to learn the language of the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeois are the owners of the means of capital. So they're very specific understandings of what they're talking about, and then they further break down the bourgeois into sort of elite bourgeois, aristocratic bourgeois, the sort of the merchant bourgeois, which are like the shop owners and stuff, which they almost like hold a little bit of disdain for. Actually, they hold disdain for all of them, but they hold a little more disdain for the people at the bottom who are helping to participate in this behavior, according to Marx. So the bourgeois, remember, are just the owners of the means of production. The aristocracy is something very different, and they are constantly referring to the aristocracy. If you remember the historical context of the time, what is happening is we are making the shift from medieval feudalism and sort of the fealty system, and the shift from a complete shift in the class system. And what happens is that sort of the monarchs and the barons and what are some more of these guys, like the princesses and princes, the people who, like, stupidly by rule and by blood, and by, it's called progenesis, not progenesis, oh man, what is the word? I'll remember here in a second, but the idea that you were born first, primogeniture. You were the firstborn son, so you get everything. And all of the social concepts that existed in medieval feudal times are now being destroyed, completely ripped apart. And now there is fear in the system by both the aristocracy, because capitalism doesn't need them. It has no respect for them. They have no particular skills to offer the market, and their power is devolving very quickly to those who don't have royal blood. But there's also fear at the bottom, right? So the aristocracy is afraid, but then the proletarians are afraid too. And the proletarians is just the word for labor, the labor class, the workers, the ones who sell their labor to the bourgeois, all right? And so you have to sort of think in the concepts of Marx to understand what they're trying to say, okay? So, again, the aristocracy is the sort of former elite royals, where it's all about primogeniture and bloodline and things of this sort, and marrying into, across borders, and suddenly you're a prince or a princess or whatever. The second is the bourgeoisie, and these are the owners of means of production. This ranges from sort of the former tradesmen, like the metal workers and the woodworkers and the smelters and the shopkeepers and these sorts of people, all the way up to the industrialists, the hyper-rich, the the Rockefellers, of the time. Of course, it's not analogous. It's anachronistic. But you know what I'm talking about, right? The uber rich individuals who own the factories and the means of production in the late. The late 19th century, it would have been the Rockefellers. In today's day and age, it would probably be, Bill Gates and who's the goofball from Facebook? That guy, Zuckerberg. So these are the upper echelon of the bourgeoisie, right? So, and then finally you have the proletarians. They are the ones who sell their own body and labor as a commodity, all right? So, Marx and Engels theorize. We're just going to say Marx from now on. I'm tired of doing the Marx and Engels, but please remember Engels is one of the main contributors. Marx basically says that history is class. History is all based around class struggle. And if you look at history, he's got a bit of a point, right? If you look at Roman history, it's about the legionnaires versus the senators versus the Caesar versus the plebs. You have all of these different classes. If you look at India, it's a caste system, which is just another name, maybe a more overt name for class. And so you have the Brahmins at the top, and you have the untouchables or the Dalits at the bottom. In America, even in as free market a society as we have, in America we still have classes, right? You have the working class, you have the middle class, you have the poor, and then you have the upper echelon. Where these things cross each other, is it $120,000? Is it $450,000? Is it a bajillion dollars? I don't know. And that's things for other people to decide. But there are, I think, there are different classes, and different people live very different lifestyles within that society. And so this is just Marx's point, that there have always been classes, that much of historical development has been based upon class struggle, and that major changes in societies and civilizations are based upon the overturning of the former class and the generation of a new one. All right, and Marx says at this point, and this is, you got to remember, he's writing in the late 19th century, the middle 19th century. He basically is saying that we are seeing a complete revolution in the former class system, which was medieval feudalism, basically. Some would argue mercantilism, but that was just sort of the elites, overall economy. If you really look at like the everyday life, it was medieval feudalism. And he's saying, all right, we're turning all of this over. We are exploding the system because of the Industrial Revolution. The class systems are completely degrading. There is no such thing anymore as apprentice and journeyman, or master and apprentice, or king and queen. It's just the bourgeois versus the proletarians. And in some sense, there is still an aristocracy grasping at straws, trying to survive against this new overturning of the social order. All right? There's a lot of fun quotes in here, but I don't want to spend time in the nitty-gritty. I just want to offer you the overarching theoretical underpinnings. All right, yeah, we should talk about this too, the sort of Marx and Engels. I said I wouldn't do that. Marx suggests that the new Industrial Revolution and the new revolution in general, and the overturning of the former social system, and all of the relationships between family and society and civilization and neighbor, and old versus young, and man versus woman, and every relationship that we can conceptualize is being overturned by the Industrial Revolution and by sort of the stink of money, according to Marx. And Marx has, it feels like a nostalgia for the former ways, right? He's saying that the economy and that industrial revolution and that the free market in general is going to destroy everything we know about everything. It is going to commodify the relationship between father and son, and so fathers will start to sell out their children as labor to bring in money. It will commodify the relationship between husband and wife, and so husbands will start to pimp out their wives into prostitution for the bourgeois and the dying aristocracy. It will destroy all of the sort of cultural and religious the wonderful idiosyncrasies we see across the planet with cultural and religious sort of, I guess, idiosyncrasies. It's just going to wipe all of that out and commodify into eventually one or two major religions, or even just sort of free market economics, and religion will disappear too. But so will culture, and so will language. So he makes some very interesting points. He also says that the free market inevitably has to spread itself like a virus across the planet, and whatever is profitable is what our culture becomes. And it destroys the former cultures that exist in this new place that it's eking its way into, and it wipes away all of their non-profitable culture and religion and replaces it with the new prophet of Mammon, the god of money, and just whatever is profitable, right? So if that new culture is profitable, maybe we'll sell it around the world. And if you sort of look at what happened in Japan, right? America came into Japan, commodified their entire culture, destroyed their former religious and familial ties, sold all of their products and tried to Americanize Japan, but then realized that the cute little stuff is sellable across the world too, and so they sort of kept that, and that's why you see this exploding otaku culture in Japan. And so there are some very, very interesting and poignant points that Marx makes, and some predictions about the way that the world will look when the free market spreads itself like a virus, as he says, into every nook and cranny of the planet. Really interesting stuff. Now, I would also point to the idea that Marx suggests that you're going to get extraordinary inequality, and that unless... He basically says we just need to destroy the entire system, and we'll talk about that later, what would replace it and everything. But his implications are that the super rich, the bourgeois, are going to exploit labor only in the sense that they can get a marginal benefit out of it, right? We've talked about this in economics. It's really funny that we sort of talk in many of the ways that he is describing literarily. We just use graphics to describe the same sorts of things that he's talking about. So he suggests that the bourgeois and the firms are just going to utilize labor as a commodity and will only pay them in so much as they can derive the greatest profit from their labor, and that this means basically paying most labor just above the subsistence line and keeping them in poverty so that they have to continue to work and continue to propagate the free market system, right? And in a sense, he's right. I would retort that there are some phenomenal things that come from the free market system, including technology and advancements and all of these things. So, like I said, I'll give my retort at the end. But he does have some very interesting points about exploitation, and we've seen all of these things play out, right? And governments eventually must step in if they want to save the free market from complete revolution from underneath. People start to get very angry when they're being exploited or when their children's hands are being cut off in factories. And the government eventually steps in and says, "Look, if we're gonna save free market, then there have to be limits." And this is why they put in minimum wages and safety and OSHA. And again, we can argue about sort of tweaking the margins, but I don't think anyone thinks that it is okay to exploit children's tiny little hands because they can fix machinery. There have to be limits, right? And Marx makes the point that, like, at this time, in this day and age, there were no limits. It was really the bourgeois keeping workers at bare subsistence, and forcing children and women and all of these into grueling, brutal work days. So you can see sort of why people were so angry when we look back in with today's sort of 2020 vision in hindsight. We live a very different life, and our sort of factories and our job culture even looks very, very different from the devastating and brutal sort of factory floors of the 19th century. Also, Marx says that there will be extraordinary inequality. And this is because the bourgeois are just going to siphon as much money as they possibly can, and without limits, they're going to just buy up more and more power, whether that be political power, whether it be land, whether it be factories or technologies. They're just going to roll in more money into further enriching themselves, not their society. And there are some really interesting things. I'm going to post a video about inequality from Harvard University. But also, I found this really cool little statistic here. There's a nice map of what's happening even just here in the United States. So if you look at 2007 and you check the land ownership in acreage of the top 100 land owning families in America, all right, they own all of Maine and New Hampshire in 2007. Okay, if you just added it up and you sort of stuck it over onto the East Coast, they would own these two states in 2007. Now, 10 years later, if you look at 2017, and lots of this is because of the collapse, and the people at the bottom are far more likely to go bankrupt and lose everything than the people at the top, right? And so this is what happened. All of the people at the bottom, after the 2007-2008 crash, they went bankrupt. They had to sell off assets. Companies had to sell off assets, and land is an asset. And so the super rich, again, the 100 biggest landowners in America, now have bought, in a single decade, 3 more states. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, right? And so it's just wild. They have increased by 50%. It looks like about 48.5%, if I'm just doing it roughly in my head. 48.5% increase in land ownership in 10 years. And it has gotten worse since 2017. So, he has some points to make, and he makes some really very interesting predictions about just the patterns of human behavior. What incentivizes people? Money incentivizes people, and people want money and power, and so they will do just about anything. Yes, you find those alternative hypotheticals where, sure, the business owner or the owner of the means of production does not manipulate and use their labor, but on average, human behavior says that's exactly what happens, okay? And we've seen it historically, that's exactly what happens. And so this incredible inequality was another one of the predictions of Karl Marx that we see coming true, and America is one of the worst about it on earth, actually. So something to think about. All right, let's see. Okay, that is, man, honestly, that's about it. I'd say read through the notes. Of course, read the book. It's very interesting. It's only like 50 pages. Um, it's not that hard of a read, honestly. Just jump in and do it. As you should jump in and do every one of your readings. I've noticed that some of you, I don't think, did much of the reading in the last test. So get in there and do the work. It's your responsibility, all right? All right, the last thing that I would say is Marx provides a list of 10 sort of starter policies that they would put into place. And I think this is wonderful. I think the idea that, yes, everyone argues about philosophy all the time. Like, what is our political philosophy? And freedom this and liberty that and, love and empathy this. But there's never any real policy suggestions. Sure, how do you do that in reality? Yes, we would all like everyone to be equal. Yes, we would all love for there to be, the equality of opportunity in our society. Yes, we would all love a fixed education system, in America. Yes, we would all love new infrastructure in America. How do we do it? Stop talking about what we need and start putting things down on paper. So this is a really good example. I love that Marx did this. A lot of this is wrong, and a lot of it would completely collapse our economic system, is what I would say. So in that sense, it's not wrong, because Marx just says that, like, this is a kinder, more empathetic way to run a large market without getting greedy and disgusting, I would also say that no quote-unquote communist system ever in history has looked anything like Marx's dream, okay? They were wildly twisted by Pol Pot and by Deng Xiaoping and by Mao Zedong and by, Papa Joe Stalin. These are bad people, okay? But the free market has also been hijacked by some really bad people in the past. So I don't know if it's about that. I think that it got out of hand because of politics and philosophy, not because they were sort of following the rules of Marx's vision. So, with that retort, here are the common policy goals. You have the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purpose. So basically, you could have private ownership of sort of your own domicile, but all other land is public, and industries basically would be, I guess, run by the state and would be given land to borrow from the people, I guess, is his philosophy. He would also suggest a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. This is really interesting because much of the world has a graduated income tax. There's really no such thing as a flat tax, not in the real world. I guess you could suggest that, like, a sales tax is a flat tax, but even that's not true because purchasable, consumable items are a far larger portion of the bottom of society, and so it affects them far more than it does the rich. So it's a very interesting argument. But I would also say that with the progressive or graduated income tax, this is how America was run at America's sort of peak. In the 1950s, 60s, we had very, very high tax brackets on the very, very wealthy, right? Because it was sort of assumed that you became very wealthy because of all of the wonderful things that America provides, like education, a great workforce, excellent infrastructure and technology and all of these sorts of things. And because you've become so super rich, you should have to contribute back to your society. And then around 1980 with Reagan, they started severely chopping at that highest tax bracket and otherwise, and started pulling the curve back down like this, so that yes, the super rich do pay more than sort of the bottom and the middle classes, but not much more, not nearly where we were in the 1960s and 1970s when we could provide a lot more, I guess, taxable income, and the government provided a lot more things like infrastructure and technology and research and development. So interesting. And I would also suggest that most of the countries that collapsed in 2007 and 2008, so we're talking about France, Ireland, Britain, Greece, a lot of these countries, they have the same sort of slightly graduated tax brackets like America does. And the countries that have very high progressive taxation, a much more of a curve, a vertical curve, like Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark, they tended to survive best after 2007 and 2008. They had more income sitting and waiting. They had more room to lower taxes later when there was a problem, to stimulate the economy through the lowering of taxes. They were able to just force more money into the economy through investment projects like infrastructure and other stuff. So something to think about. It's a really interesting phenomenon that some of these countries are actually starting to do best, the ones with the most graduated taxing systems. Netherlands, Sweden, Switzerland, North Korea, not North Korea, good Lord, not North Korea, South Korea, these sorts of states. So, again, food for thought. Number 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. This is an interesting argument. They are suggesting that your assets after your death should basically all go back to the state. And America has put a cap on this where you don't have to. I'll have to double check this actually, and I'll check back in with you if I can remember. I'll do my best here. I'll note it actually. Taxes on inheritance. Okay, so he basically says that there shouldn't be any taxes on inheritance. If you want an actual fair system, then people should actually have to earn their way in life. And so that in America, the last time I checked, it was like the $2.5 million. Once you get past that, your inheritance is taxed at that $2.5 million plus, but anything under that can be directly willed to your family. But again, I'll have to check those numbers. And this is a really touchy subject for both sides. Like Democrats don't want there to be inheritance. They don't want Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump or whomever, or Bill Gates' kids, or whoever it is. They don't want them to be able to just walk away with $1 billion and say that, like, this is fair, we earned it. BS, right? But then on the other side, conservatives, they also say, look, we earned this as a family. I have every right to give these to my kids because my fortune is tied to my name, not me as an individual. Which is also a good point. So there are some really interesting arguments, and this is one that is we still have not come up with an answer yet. And people talk about it all the time, but we've come up with a compromise. And again, I'll check on that compromise, but the last time I checked, it was like $2.5 million. Okay. Number 4, confiscation of the property of immigrants and rebels. So if you want to leave our country and be a citizen somewhere else, we're taking your stuff. I always thought, like, man, that's cold-hearted, And then rebels, I can kind of see that. Like, if you take up arms against your own country, I can see that. You're going to be imprisoned, and your country sort of has a right to your stuff. That's a little more acceptable than if you want to be an immigrant. Like, what if you get a job in another country and you've lived there for years and you're just like, oh, I might as well. I'll get tax benefits for being in this country or whatever. We're going to take your stuff. Whoa, Carl. Okay, number 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. This is, I think, his best suggestion. And this actually is something that Alexander Hamilton in America fought very hard for and was eventually shot down by the Jeffersonian Democrats. And so now we see this highly independent banking system, which is also a lot of reason why we've seen the redlining against blacks and minorities, the difficulty for minorities and the poor in general to get access to credit. Yeah, there are problems with the idea of independent banking systems. Independent banking systems also have an incentive to over-leverage themselves, as we saw in 2007 and 2008. And so if they're not being monitored, things can get very out of hand very quickly. And we didn't have much oversight. The SEC was toothless, and so we saw a complete collapse of our economy. And so Marx and Alexander Hamilton also suggested that there should be a nationalized bank, that there should be established rules about how credit works and who gets access to it and all of these sorts of things. It would be a very easy way for government to stimulate economics because government, I guess we've seen the mess that this whole $1,400 thing has caused, because it's like, all right, well, I have 62,000 different banks I need to get this to, and these ones have these problems, and this one has this problem, and these have this problem, and I can't figure out the numbers for this one, and blah blah blah. So I guess they're arguing for efficiency, but they're also arguing that the state can be a lot more fair about the distribution of credit, because the Communist Party doesn't see really gender, it doesn't see nationality, it doesn't see color or race. It just sees labor versus bourgeoisie. Okay. All right. Number 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. This one's very interesting. So this would suggest a lot more public. I tried to conceptualize how this would work. I think it's a really interesting idea. The state, say, would just own millions of vehicles, I guess. And they'd probably get a huge discount. They'd probably have to make them themselves, I guess, because this is communism. But you'd have a huge fleet of vehicles. You'd have private vehicles that, I guess, under today's technology, you could just sort of call up or Uber up or whatever. You could have a huge fleet of moving vehicles. You would have an enormous sort of railroad system. I don't think that it would work. It'd be really difficult, at least to transition there from where we are. Interesting idea, though. Okay. Number 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing of the cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Marx and Engels, you have to remember, is a very agricultural time. They're just making the shift from sort of agriculture to the factory life. They see there being a lot of potential for feeding the people, for employing people on farmland, and for developing your state by sort of spreading people out instead of the inevitable urbanization that comes from the efficiencies that are necessary for the Industrial Revolution and for the free market system. And so instead of that, the agglomeration of this people and the death of the rural culture and the spreading of the disease of liberal thought and anti-religion and anti-culture, Instead of that, we would see a strengthening of the rural and a spreading out of the people, and the state would pay to help the soil. So anyway, that's the idea. Number 8, equal liability of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. So you have to work. Unless basically you're handicapped. There are exceptions to the state, right? You're handicapped, you're elderly, you're a child. Of course, we don't need you working. We also want to try to match people up to their best skill, right? And Marx and Engels and the communists think that the state could do a marvelous job in doing so. And you actually see some evidence of that with sort of the tripartite education systems of, say, Germany, Japan, where you take the lesser performing children at about, you track their development until about 12, and at that point you determine, look, this kid is probably not going to crack cancer, but still, I mean, he'd be a great welder, or he'd be great at building cars, or he'd be a great farmer, or he'd be great at like testing water for pollution, or whatever it is. I don't know. There are a billion jobs out there, right? But the point is, they start to shift them at about 12 years old. And they say, all right, you're going to go to this sort of trade-focused school, welding, manufacturing, that sort of stuff, and we're going to teach you all of the things that you would need to know to survive in society, all these things. The middle kids, you're going to go sort of to the middle path. You might be the managers or the secretary. I shouldn't say that. That's not a nice word anymore, apparently. The executive assistants. What else? You know, you might be a factory supervisor, that sort of thing. And then there's sort of the A tier, and we're going to prepare you to be a university professor or a scientist or to run a lab or these sorts of things, right? And so they sort of, you get this tripartite split, and they do it in Japan, they do it in Germany. In America, I don't think it's possible because of race, because of the difficulty of trying to say we're going to split people up, especially as inequitable as our schooling systems are, right? You can't just tell the poorly performing kids that you're going to the poorly performing schools, because it's, in a sense, it's the state's fault that they're performing so poorly, right? In Japan and Germany, everybody kind of gets the same level of schooling. In America, that's not really true. And so I don't think you could ever implement this sort of thing in the United States. Okay, number 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. So this is what I was talking about, sort of the reverse of urbanization, which is the inevitable occurrence of the free market system and the efficiencies that come from having all of your labor forced into one place. Now we want to sort of spread it out and to be able to develop our entire land and people and culture in all of these different individual places. We want to sort of support all of these intricate differences in culture and religion and language and these sorts of things, and art and etc. All right. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. The combination of education with industrial production, etc. All right, and so this is just about the treatment of children. It's about free access to schools, and I think that they would argue equal schools. Everyone's being taught equally. Everyone has the same chance in these schools. They're being provided with the same resources. These sorts of things. The abolition of children's factory labor. Thank goodness we've gotten rid of that since then. And the combination of education and industrial production is sort of what I was talking about with the tripartite system. The state, in some senses, getting involved in trying to make the most efficient decisions about where people should go, where individuals should be trained and what sort of job they should have, and how we can fill the different niches that are needed in our society. Like right now in America, we are in desperate straits for nurses. And we were even before COVID. But the United States is really bad about first letting in professionals from other countries because Americans, we just don't have enough nurses. And then second, incentivizing people to go to nursing school, right? We're bad at both of those. So this is the idea that the state will in some ways, not necessarily 100%, but they will help to develop where you end up by data, by tracking, by this sort of thing. All right. I wanted to touch on one last thing in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 and sort of the end of the book. Like I said, it's really interesting stuff, and it's Marx's and Engels' retorts to different philosophies and different communist visions and different socialist visions and even what they called communistic conservatism or something that really made me laugh. His retort was like, all right, this is just the bourgeoisie convincing the proletariats that they need the bourgeoisie and love the bourgeoisie for forcing them into their exploitative position. So it was a cute little like 2 or 3 page retort that I had fun with. Okay. There were some really interesting points that he makes at the end, and I would just touch on a few. I touched on a couple. One is he makes this very interesting and, I guess, provocative, because it's been discussed many times by many people, this provocative analogy between the asceticism of communism and socialism and the asceticism of the teachings of Christ. And the idea that Christ taught about poverty and community and giving alms, and that is what socialism does too. So it was very interesting. The second one was the point about extreme inequality. He made some really prescient predictions about the state of the world and what it will look like even unto the future. Just because these are the natural behaviors that first the bourgeoisie takes because they want to enrich themselves. And then because of that one assumption that the bourgeoisie want to further enrich themselves, here are all of the things that will happen in our society: the breaking up of the family, extreme inequality, the snatching up of land, these sorts of things. He also says that it's inevitable that you'll see more war, or you will see industrialism as war, and so that sometimes the state will set up war as a way to bolster their economy. And there are some that argue that this is what happened both in the early 1990s in the First Iraq War, but also in World War II. And if you go talk to your political science professor, Wes Jameson, who is my best friend, you will also, he does a lot of research about this idea, about the idea that the state can use war as an industrial and economic boost, and that there is something to be learned about seeing the world as an industrial mechanism for making war, and war as profiteering, and war as economic progress. So some interesting stuff that Marx talked about, hundreds of years ago, 100 or more years ago. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed. I guess I should retort. Marx is wrong. Marx is wrong about at least his basic philosophy, right? You have to incentivize work. That's the other side of the free market system. And it's hard to conceptualize how to incentivize further work and further productivity without some sort of free market system. And now I'm not saying that necessarily the bourgeoisie should be able to exploit the proletarians in an exploitative and rapacious way. That's where government should probably step in and set limits, and where those limits are is what we can argue about. Children shouldn't be on factory floors. Like there is a place for government here. Where that limit is what our parties argue about. But I don't think that his main thesis that we can just live in this utopian society where the state shifts everyone into their perfect job, and because of that everybody works hard and we have this delicious, wonderful lifestyle where everyone's equal. And come on, that's not real. He does make some really poignant points, and he makes some very interesting remarks about the natural tendencies of the bourgeois. And their natural tendencies and behaviorism towards those labor and the commodity that is labor, which is a really scary thought, right? You don't want to think of yourself as a product. You're a human, and you have culture, and you have beliefs, and you have art and love, and this stuff doesn't fit in sort of Marx's view of who the bourgeois are, and it really doesn't fit with the sort of the amoral economics. The science of economics is just about incentives and behavior. It's not about morals. And so if we look at some of what we've been studying this entire time, some of it is naturally immoral, I think, in the ways that most humans conceptualize what is a moral way to treat another person, what is a moral way to live a respectful and respectable life and have dignity and these sorts of things. I don't think that the market naturally wants to give you those things, right? And so there's going to be this push and pull of, I want to live a dignified life, I'm a human being, versus I need to make a profit, and we need to develop our society and our economy, and where is this push and pull end up? And that's we fight this every day in our lives and in our economy. So really interesting stuff. It's largely wrong again, but there are some excellent points to be made. He has a beautiful writing style, and he has a deep history of economics and world and cultural history, at least in the larger European setting. So it's a great read. It's a worthwhile read, and you should know it. You should know it. It's one of the most interesting and culturally revolutionizing books that has ever been written on Earth. All right, and so don't just completely disregard it, please. All right, have a wonderful day, and I will see you soon, and I'll get the next chapters up soon. All right, stay happy and healthy. Bye.